700 years ago, this October, an event took place that literally shocked Christendom. The most powerful religious military order in the world was assaulted, had its assets taken, its churches forcibly closed, and was accused of not only betraying the church, but of denying Christ himself. Temple Church here in London was one of the great centres of the Knights Templar, an international, a multinational organisation that had a network that stretched throughout Europe, the Middle East and beyond. It was undoubtedly enormously powerful. But the Knights Templar exercise a fascination that grabs us today. Why? Well, frankly, I'm not inclined to believe conspiracy theories. Usually there is a very straightforward historical explanation of strange events and goings-on. Is it possible that the Knights Templar are an exception? It was the writer Dan Brown in his imaginative novel The Da Vinci Code who really relaunched fascination with the Knights Templar. And in his book he acknowledges his debt to another book, The Templar Revelation, written by two London-based authors, Lynn Picknett and Clive Prince. And I've come to a busy cafe in London to meet Lynn and to ask you, Lynn, before I set off on my journey, what do you think I should really look for?
Concentrate on their obsession with secrecy and power. They only acknowledged the authority of the Pope. They basically saw themselves as being equal of kings. I do think they might have accrued things like Gnostic Gospels, and also they were themselves into knowledge, into discovering anything. Look out for anything connected with a secret heretical veneration for John the Baptist. I do believe, from various bits of evidence that Clive Prince and I have accrued, that there was an inner circle. The very people who were supposed to be the knights of Christ and, upholding Christendom against the infidel were perhaps themselves, not all of them of course, but perhaps themselves undermining it from within.
So were they this amazingly powerful organisation, unbelievably wealthy? Well, to find the answer to that, I've come to Denny Abbey in Cambridgeshire. This was a monastery, then it became a farm, now it's a museum. But in the late 13th century, this was, of all things, a retirement home for old Knights Templars. And I come here to meet one of the world's leading experts on the Crusades, Professor Jonathan Riley-Smith.
Well, this was an estate which they were given in around about 1170. The military orders, of which the Templars, of course, were the first, had huge expenses, fortifying their castles and maintaining their garrisons in the east. And so all over Europe they were given estates which provided them with the resources to do so.
Let's go inside the church and get a little more of this extraordinary story of how military force and religion comes together in this way. This is a wonderful, wonderful place. There's columns and pillars and capitals springing out everywhere, but here we're right in the centre of, I guess, under the tower, judging from the arches and with the transepts either side. Why are they called Knights Templar? What is the temple of the Templars?
The Templars were given in an extraordinary act of generosity by a king of Jerusalem, Baldwin II, his own palace, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, at one end of the temple esplanade. And that is why they were called Templars.
So why did a religious order come into existence that was given permission to kill?
The origins of the temple lie in a panic that was sweeping the settlements established by the First Crusade in 1118, 19 years after Jerusalem had been taken by the First Crusaders. A large army got together by the settlers in the north, in Syria, had been wiped out by the Muslims. In Jerusalem itself, there were already bodies of noblemen or knights, and a group of these had attached themselves to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And it was this group that decided in this situation to form themselves into a religious confraternity, then order, committed to the defence of the pilgrim routes and, in a wider sense, the defence of Christendom. Now, to understand how Christians could accept that religious, that is, men who have professed themselves to follow a religious way of life, making vows of poverty, celibacy and obedience, why such men could also bear weapons, because canon law forbid clergy of all sorts, whether ordained or not, from bearing arms. The reason, of course, lies in the revolutionary nature of the crusade, and the importance of crusading is it was not simply holy war, it was penitential war.
Well, I've come in out of the wind and the cold out there to the education base, and there's a set of drawers here which have objects found when the abbey was excavated in the late 60s, early 70s. So, for example, in this top drawer we've got a Roman coin and fragments of pottery, shells that would have been part of the diet here of the shellfish and other things like that. However, I am told that it is the bottom drawer that one wants to look. Good grief. It is not often that you find a skeleton in the bottom drawer of a set of chest of drawers, but here we have not a complete skeleton, but a pretty complete skeleton. A priest for the Knights Templar, and with him, when he was found a really extraordinary pattern. This is the plate on which the priest would have put the consecrated bread when serving communion. However, this is made of lead. This was, as it were, a dummy one that would have been buried with him, but it's got the most beautiful, faint, delicate outline of a cross. But what's fascinating is that the whole thing has clearly been done with a compass. Now, one of the great things that the Templars did was that they brought back from the Crusades a great deal of Arabic knowledge about maths and science. And one of the things they brought back was the compass. And you can see the centre point where they put it and did the centre circle, and then they did 2 circles on the far outside. And then the actual shape of the cross itself is done also with a compass. A wonderful fusion, if you like, between Arab knowledge and Christian piety. So, where to next? Well, one of the really fascinating things is that if you look in a road atlas of Great Britain and you look up Temple, there's loads of them. There's Temple in Cornwall, there's Temple Bar, Temple Cloud, Temple Coombe, Temple Ure, Temple Grafting, Temple Gooting. But I've been told that if you actually want to see what a Knight Templar looked like, then you need to go to Temple Balsall, which is in Warwickshire. So, that's where we're off next. Well, I've come to the exquisite church of Temple Balsall. It's an enormous church, actually incredibly high, almost like a cathedral in feel. Now here, supporting the great wooden arches of the roof, are corbels holding the wooden beams up. And I brought my binoculars so I can see properly, because at the base of these wooden pillars are Knights Templars. My goodness, they are very dramatic. These are figures almost life-size, coming out of the walls from sort of the chest up, holding their swords and their shields. What's so powerful about them, particularly about the ones that are the original ones, there are copies here from the 19th century, these are men harrowed by experience, their deep-sunk eyes, haggard expression. These are men who've given their lives and their health and their strength for the defense of Christianity. And there's something else up here as well. Now, that I was not expecting at all. Higher up on the wall, holding up one of the other arches, is another corbel, and carved on it is a figure which I've only ever seen in medieval stained glass window, and I think we've actually got a carving of King Solomon. He's wearing the headgear of a high priest of Israel, and because Solomon built the first temple on the Temple Mound, hence Temple Balsall, he was venerated and respected by the Knights Templars, and I've just never seen anything like it. This is a carving of King Solomon himself looking down on the poor soldiers of Christ of the Temple of Solomon. My goodness. Well, quite clearly, the place names are not secret. Nobody was embarrassed to have the Templar name associated with their village or their town. But I wonder if there is any truth about them being such a secretive society that they've continued into the contemporary world. Are they a secret society? You see, I think this mystery around them is a much later fabrication. Take, for example, Solomon and his temple. That's essentially completely reinvented by the Freemasons in the 18th century. Now, a little earlier, I went onto the web, and if you type in Templars UK, up comes the Grand Priory of Knights Templar in England and Wales, and indeed it opens with a warm welcome. And they've got charities and the such like. Indeed, there's a picture of them presenting a document to the Bishop of Lincoln. He obviously doesn't think that they're a secret heretical sect. They're wearing the regalia of the Knights Templar. They have the red cross on their left shoulder on the white mantle. And according to their history, they were founded in Paris in 1804, and they come to this country in 1960. They seem to be a very open society. Now, what I've arranged to do is not to meet the Grand Master of the Priory, but to meet the webmaster, Jeff Beck, and to ask him what draws him to this modern version of an ancient order.
Well, it started off in my early teens. The Richard Lee book, a Michael Asian book, The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, had just been published. Of course, out of that came this Templar thread. So rather than read it in a conspiracy context, I wanted to read purely about the Knights Templar and what they did. Then in my early 20s, I was invited to join the Freemasons, who have a Templar degree, but I turned that down. And it was only later I actually came across the original website myself and got in touch with the order that way.
But you also have a family link back to the original Knights
Well,
Templar.
doing some research on the family coat of arms, it was quite interesting that when the arms are actually dug out, in the bottom quadrant of the shield was an 8-pointed Templar cross. It's having this sort of belief in the chivalry of what was going on, which I thought was missing in the modern world. And then seeing that, it was almost fate had knocked me on the head sort of thing. Time to wake up.
Now, as we've been doing this journey, one person said to us, "Oh, how interesting, the new order. Why would anybody want to be associated with a heretical, infidel, slaughtering, murderous bunch of thugs?" Your answer to that, Jeff?
I've always taken the view that history tends to be written by the victors. The original concept of the Templars, which was brought about by Hugh de Payens, was purely to help protect the pilgrims. The Templars were actually very heavily involved in the diplomacy of the time. There was a lot of good relationships that occurred within all the faiths in the Holy Lands at the time. Today, we're actively involved in carrying that on, in not only helping on a charitable basis, but we have a lot of programs going on in the Middle East to actually try and help the peace process out there.
Well, I've just met Jeff Beck at his preceptory, his centre, here in the church of the beautiful little village of Temple Combe in Somerset. And I've now crossed across to the other side of the church to look at an artefact that has probably done more to fuel the notion that the Knights Templars were heretics, that they were hiding a terrible secret, than probably any other artefact in Britain. It's hanging on the wall here. It's a painting. It's about the size of a dining room table, and it was discovered just over 50 years ago doing service as the roof of a cowshed. And a woman happened to look up, and the plaster had fallen away, and there looking down at her was an immensely powerful face. It's just a head, but it's a head of a man harrowed by experience and pain by the look of it. It's surrounded by a frame which could be a window, it could be rather like a frame around an icon. It's got flanges coming out at either side, but you're drawn straight to this powerful face and these eyes. Is this, as some have argued, the most concrete evidence that at the heart of the Knights Templar there was a heresy that they had picked up from the Mandeans in the Middle East. The Mandeans, still to this day, believe that John the Baptist was the true Messiah and that Christ usurped his place. Is this evidence that the Knights Templar worshipped John the Baptist? Here, beheaded, his head lying on a platter, as happened when he offended King Herod? Well, no. I have seen many images like this in my travels through the Orthodox world in Constantinople, Greece, the Middle East, Russia. This is a classic Orthodox image called the handkerchief of Saint Veronica. And the story, it's a beautiful story, a legend, goes that as Christ was on his way to crucifixion, he stumbles, and Saint Veronica rushes forward with a damp cloth, which she presses to his face to cool him down in the heat and pain of his passion. And when she takes the cloth away, there, imprinted on it through the sweat and the heat, is the image of Christ. But there is a wonder about this painting, because I think what we've got is a most wonderful example of how the Knights Templars, indeed the Crusades in general, put Catholic England in touch with the Orthodox Middle East. And here, in an ordinary parish church in Somerset, we have an icon brought from the great Orthodox world, brought here by the Knights Templar. And that, for me, is both a wonder and a mystery. Well, from a long hidden painting and its mystery, I've come to a Herefordshire valley and to find something else that was long hidden from sight. In fact, only discovered early last century. I've come to Garway in Herefordshire, and what I'm looking for are the ruined foundations of, and here they are, of the Knights Templars' round church. There's not a lot left, to be honest, and indeed, to be frank, it looks as though it's not only been demolished, it's been stamped on, because running right across it is a far more conventional church, one that you would expect to find in any village in England. And being stamped on is exactly what happened to the Knights Templars. On the fateful night of the 13th of October, 1307, Philip the Fair, King of France, seized virtually the entire leadership of the Knights Templar, and he accused them of the most astonishing things, of heresy, of apostasy, of corruption, of the most vile crimes. I've come here to meet Dr. Helen Nicholson, who's at the University of Wales in Cardiff, and to ask her what on earth was going on.
Contemporaries outside France said it was because Philip wanted the Templars' money.
Do you believe that?
I think that was a factor, but I don't think it was the only factor.
What else?
The king also needed to convince his own subjects that he was a great Christian king. He had a grandfather who'd been on crusade, his father had been on crusade, he had not been on crusade. He'd wasted his time fighting good Christian kings instead of fighting the Muslims. He had had a long-running battle with the papacy over the church's finances in France. In fact, he had been responsible for the death of Pope Boniface VIII.
And once he gets this whole process of clamping down on the Templars going, out come these extraordinary charges of idol worship, of spitting on the cross, and all sorts of other things. Are we dealing with charges that were exclusive to this trial of the Templars?
The most serious charges are the usual stuff that have been trotted out against every heretical group since at least the beginning of the 11th century.
So are you saying that nowhere in the Templar world these strange rituals were going on? This is all made up?
Yes. Because if they wanted to get involved in strange rituals, they didn't have to join the Templars. There were other religious orders about which people complained. Walter Map, who lived just up the road from here, said that the Cistercians got up to terrible things, abusing young boys and digging up their neighbours' trees and moving them. The friars were accused of abducting young women for their own foul deeds.
So in other words, we're not dealing with charges that are exclusively about this order. There was a general mocking of religious orders in this most religious period.
Yes. In fact, if you read Chaucer, you will see that. And he's writing not many years after, a couple of generations after the trial of the Templars.
But then the Inquisition takes over. Is there a sense of inevitability about what happened in France, that once this thing is set rolling, you couldn't stop it? Or Could the Knights Templars have really kind of got in there and argued their case and won?
The Templars were not educated men. They had hardly any lawyers. They simply didn't have the intellectual capacity or the training to defend themselves.
So this is not a secret society of the most amazing intellectuals who discovered occult secrets. This is a bunch of, frankly, not very bright fighting men.
Yes.
But here, in the British Isles, is a very different story.
The secular authorities were not interested in the trial and did not become involved in it, unlike in France where the king was involved. The bishops were not particularly interested in the trial and only became involved when they were ordered to by the Pope, and then tried to deal with the whole thing as quickly and as cleanly as possible and tidy it all up. In fact, the trial in Britain finished in July 1311. The Pope didn't actually wind everything up until the following spring. But by that time, all the Templars in the British Isles had been asked to abjure all heresy and sent away to monasteries to do penance and receive their pensions, and that was that.
Well, in pursuit of the answer to a couple of vital questions, I've returned to Denny Abbey and to meet Professor Jonathan Riley-Smith again. And the two questions are very straightforward. What kind of state were the Knights Templar in by the time we get to Philip the Fair in 1307? And were they heretics? Were they actually Christ deniers?
I think the first thing to say is that the order was in chaos, right down, from top to bottom. The thing was in an utter mess. And there is one of the accusations, and it's in many ways the most important, which I think sticks. I've come to the conclusion that in some commanderies, some of these Templar houses in France, Italy and the Holy Land, recruits were being forced to deny Christ and spit on a cross. That should have been going on at all is absolutely scandalous. But what is worse in a way is it seems as though the senior officers in the order knew it was going on, but couldn't do anything about it.
So, this is an extraordinary accusation, isn't it? As you say. What is going on? I mean, are we dealing here with essentially an all-male group, rather like the army occasionally loses control of some of its recruits? They set up, rituals of initiation that then somebody dies because they've been beaten up or whatever, and the whole thing blows up. Or are we dealing with something that is actually more sinister than that?
You get echoes of the discussions the Templars themselves were having while in prison. And some of them clearly believe in rather bizarre stories like pacts with the devil or whatever. There are more rational explanations that are coming up. One is that this was a ritualistic reference to St. Peter denying Christ before the crucifixion. Another was that it was a test to, just in case they were captured by the Muslims and forced to apostatize, to see whether they would apostatize or not. The important thing to me is that the senior officials in the order should have stopped it. And they were so wet, and the machine they were managing worked so badly that they couldn't do anything about it.
From Denny Abbey, I've travelled back to London, to the Temple Church, which was once the heart of the power of the Templars in England. Indeed, for a while, they straddled the city and even controlled the river. Here was an organisation that arose in 1119 to answer a need, how to protect the pilgrims and indeed the Holy Land itself against Muslim attacks. They were very successful. They managed this for many decades. But by 1291, when the last Crusader foothold in the Holy Land had fallen, Acre, they had no purpose. And unlike other orders, they weren't able to reinvent themselves. And so, as with all organisations that lose their way and their purpose, they began to fall apart. And this made it very easy for people to level charges against them, not just of incompetence, but of the medieval version of incompetence, which in a sense was the charges of heresy. But they left us a legacy, and it's a very important one. They linked us to the wealth and the vision and the power and the historic sites of the Orthodox Church, and indeed of Christianity's heartland itself. And there is perhaps no better example than this church here, Temple Church, with its circular nave built to look like the shrine that surrounds the tomb of Christ in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. And so, to end my journey, I've come to meet a master, indeed the master of Temple Church, Reverend Robin Griffiths-Jones.
They were building in their round churches a recreation of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which, like our church, has a giant colonnade, a tall inner drum, a walkway for pilgrims around it. We are effectively, by walking in here, walking into the Holy Sepulchre itself. I do think, as a round building, it is in itself very extraordinary. Round buildings have a completely different atmosphere to any other building. They have no angles by which we can orientate ourselves. I am not suggesting that this is a symbol of the eternal feminine, but a round building does in fact embrace and encircle you. It really does. And it does give a completely different sense of space.
And today, you have been at the centre of quite a lot of attention, some wanted, some unwanted, I'm sure. But what do people think they're coming to?
I'm sure you realise, although we are avoiding mention of the novel's title, that there is a certain well-known book that has drawn a great many people here. And it has been rather startling over the last 3 years. When the craze started, huge numbers of visitors arrived in search of the one tomb that has no effigy on it. It's over on our northern side, it's deeply uninteresting, there is almost nothing to recommend it. And many a visitor came, saw it, looked slightly crestfallen, and left. Things have changed. It may be because we have ourselves mounted quite a response to the novel. We've tried to explain slightly more of what the church is about. It may also be, of course, that visitors have now heard more about the stories of the Templars and their buildings and Jerusalem, so they come here much better informed and much more alert to the possible background. And I think it is now the case that among the very, very many visitors we're having, far more raise their eyes and look around and just see what a very, very special place this is. So I'm very pleased to say that that the focus has rather broadened, and people now, I think, have much more sense that, gosh, this is special.